Hello everyone and welcome to MMA Start to Finish. I'm Julian and this is Matt.
Hi.
And today we'll be talking about UFC 8, titled UFC 8 David versus Goliath. Going into this, I didn't think we'd have a lot of like inside baseball-y news to share with you, but after going through the Wikipedia page and the Wikipedia page of some of the fighters, we have a packed show with a lot of weird shit.
Yeah, there's some weird stuff going on.
Quite a bit. Before we get into the weird shit, some like administrative stuff. The time limit was slightly changed from UFC 7 where, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, they had that convoluted-ass system where the first round was 15 minutes, the second round was 18 minutes, of the tournament, that is, and the finals and the super fight were 27 minutes, which is extremely weird, with 3-minute overtimes. But they realized that was fucking dumb, and in UFC 8, they changed it to 10-minute fights, with the finals and super fight being 15-minute fights. Interesting, given that modern fights are longer than 10 minutes now. But again, this is all consecutive. There are no rounds.
So it's still harder, but easier in a way?
Well, at least now you can kind of train for a fight where you know how long you're going to be going. You know what I mean? Like, you have some expectation of how long this fight will go. Whereas when Gracie and Ken Shamrock fought, and it was, we're not going to go there again. We don't need to dig up those skeletons.
Big John McCarthy, a lot more liberal with his stand-ups.
Yeah, he did stand the fighters up a lot more, and funny enough, some of those stand-ups were kind of bullshit. It was still early enough, people didn't like really understand certain positions. I think did he stand up somebody who was like in side control, if I'm not mistaken?
I think so, because they were working, and he stood him up anyway.
Yeah, and also, oh, I think he had somebody had somebody's back. I think that's what it was. But regardless, John, a little sloppy, but give him a pass. 96. Oh, by the way, this event, the first and only event held in Puerto Rico. And
under questionable legal circumstances.
Yeah, as if that wasn't interesting enough, I got a little Wikipedia excerpt to read for you. Just days before the show, the Puerto Rican government made a rule banning the event. 2 days before the card, Cablevision became the first major carrier of what over the next few years would become nearly every major cable system in North America to ban the show, stating it never expected to air UFC or similar type of programming ever again. So yeah, here's where we see the first glimpse of the moral panic that would surround the UFC and MMA in the late 90s. This is where we see John McCain come in and call MMA human cockfighting. Apparently, this event is also notable as being the first MMA event to draw criticism, including Michigan politician Calvin McCard's on-site protest at UFC 8. So this asshole was so offended, he traveled from Michigan to Puerto Rico to complain about guys punching each other in the face.
That's a long way to fly.
It's a long way for some moral panic.
Also, Ken is now the new golden boy since the Gracie family has left.
Yeah, since the departure of Hoyce, they certainly have shifted their marketing focus to Ken, as he seems to be their poster boy, and as we'll see in the next couple years, doesn't stick around in the sport for as long as they probably would have liked, eventually transitioning to the WWF. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
They also increased the height of the fence to 6'6".
That's a really good thing, too, by the way, because those first couple fights, I'm surprised nobody just went over the top.
Yeah.
Should mention, the reason this tournament was named David and Goliath was because these assholes thought it would be fun to throw a bunch of tiny dudes in there with literal monsters.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes that actually worked out for the smaller fighter because size does not always equal technique. But sometimes, as we'd see with Paul Varelans and Joe Moreira, leads to kind of a weird stalemate where the small guy knows, I can't do shit anyway, so why am I going to dive in and get killed?
Yeah, like, we need those weight classes. We can't, as neat as it is to see this,
like, it's novel.
We can't have this consistently.
Unsustainable.
Yeah. We can't live like this.
The first fight of the night was Don the Predator Fry, who we're going to get very familiar with, the Tom Selleck clone, versus Thomas Ramirez, who, well, here's all you need to know about Thomas. Doesn't have a Wikipedia page.
No.
However, coming into this contest, claimed he had won 200 bare-knuckle matches. Whatever the fuck that means.
200-0.
Oh, undefeated.
Yeah.
Look at this guy. Well, that shit came to an end.
Yeah.
Dan actually one of many fighters tonight who took after Tank and wore those fingerless gloves. It's starting to become a regular trend because these guys are like, hey, I don't want to break my hands when I miss or when I hit you in the forehead. So, good move.
Announcing this fight, we had Rich Goyne once again, this time speaking Spanish.
He was speaking Spanish in the intro, that's right.
He was also stopping his announcements for the crowd to calm down, which is not going to happen.
Yeah, that's like literally the opposite of your job as an announcer. You're supposed to like feed into the energy of the crowd. Can you imagine if Bruce Buffer was like, I'll wait.
Yeah.
I'll wait.
He hypes them up and just stops.
It was so weird and awkward. Speaking of Bruce Buffer, we'll get to it later, but one of the fighters tonight, apparently managed by Bruce Buffer, before he was ever an announcer. So back to Don Frye versus Thomas Ramirez. Not a lot of notes here. Fight was 8 seconds long. Don just walked up to him and, as you said, double tapped him.
Yeah.
And sent him to the ground.
It was one punch, then another, and Ramirez was on the ground.
Ramirez at the time was over 400 pounds?
410 pounds.
And Don Frye, I want to say, was closer to like 205, 210. Do you have his weight listed?
Yeah. Thomas is double the weight
of Jesus Christ.
Of Don Frye. Also, just because it was funny, the card girl had her sign backwards.
There was a lot of weird hiccups with UFC staff and fans as well tonight.
Yeah.
We'll get into it later, but there was a little bit of melee in the crowd, which they did not explain at all. Kind of just... You know what? I'm just realizing it now. They don't even mention that here.
Nope.
They didn't even mention the Brawl on the Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
I do suppose, like, the government ban supersedes that a little bit. A little more important.
A little bit. We also saw... Well, you pointed this out that this probably still happens even today, but we saw people smoking in the stadium, but it was just a different time. It was just allowed.
Yeah, what I was saying was, in Puerto Rico, that shit wouldn't surprise me if that shit's still going on. But yeah, it was weird. All these events, but for whatever reason, this one in particular, just are so aggressively 90s, from everybody's haircut, to the attire, to the music, to smoking inside.
And even the background information on it is very 90s.
Extremely true. The moral panic. So, as per usual, let's take a look at the venue in which this event was held, in the Ruben Rodriguez Coliseum in Bayamon, Puerto Rico. They kept mixing it up if it was Bayamon or San Juan. They said both, but I'm pretty sure it was Bayamon. Also, Thomas Ramirez, the hometown guy from Bayamon, didn't exactly have home field advantage.
No.
So, this stadium was built in 1988. Well, I can't see here if it's closed. It doesn't say it was demolished, so I'd assume it's still open. But fun fact I'm reading here on the Wikipedia page for this venue, in December 14th, 1993, the arena hosted a Pantera concert on the Vulgar Display of Power show. During the show, Phil Anselmo sang 8 songs and left because of the mosh pit and riots that ensued during the event. So, fun fact about the Ruben Rodriguez Coliseum.
It was too crazy for Pantera.
Alright, on to the next fight. We foreshadowed it a little bit. Joe Moriera versus Paul Varlins, the polar bear, the big angry polar bear. Not so angry today.
No.
Very cautious.
Well, he was thinking this time. In the intro, like, stats...
The pre-fight intro.
Yeah, what they show of, like, what they've been practicing, what fight styles they use. They literally put one of his notes as he's thinking.
His thinker, right?
Yeah.
Like he's a fucking statue or some shit.
Yep. Paul's a little more cautious this time around.
I suspect that the reason he was so cautious in this fight was from the leg kicks he had to deal with against Marco Huas, because you could see he just kept raising his leg up during the fight to, like, check leg kicks that weren't happening. It was a little weird, and if I'm not mistaken, yeah, this was the only fight tonight that actually went to decision. And Paul Varlins would wind up defeating Joe Moriera, basically just based off of positioning. And I should probably tell you who Joe Moriera is. He didn't look great here, but it's hard to look great when a guy is... How much bigger was he? He was like 6 inches taller and like a full 60-something pounds.
Closer to a foot taller,
Jesus.
Paul Varlins, and 100 pounds bigger.
Okay, so I way undershot that shit. This
Oh,
guy's
yeah.
a monster.
Yeah.
So, fun fact about Joe Moriera, he is a very high-level jiu-jitsu practitioner, and his school lineage goes all the way back to Helio Gracie, so he has some OG shit as far as his roots go. And he holds a lot of black belts, very talented in jiu-jitsu, but did not seem to be able to transition that into a successful mixed martial arts career.
He is a coral belt.
Which is above a black belt, for those of you unaware. Which would have been me 6 months ago.
Yeah. Which, you get that by, what was it, influencing the sport itself?
Yeah, you have to, like, I
Or the
believe, if I'm
style.
not mistaken, there has to be some, like, major stylistic contribution to the sport for you to get that level. But I'm out of my element here. I don't know nearly as much about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as I do MMA. All my Jiu-Jitsu knowledge is just grounded from what I know about MMA. So, not super confident about that assertion. Oh, fun fact about this fight, by the way. We were actually having a discussion earlier because some fans decided it would be fun to bring air horns to the arena. And we were like, man, that must be confusing because, you know, they stopped the fights with an air horn. And we were like, wait a minute. Do they? And we'd find out at the end of this fight, no, they don't. They just have Ron come on the mic and go, the fight is over.
Yep.
Which is a very ineffective way to do that.
Yeah.
And then John barely stepped in to end the fight. It just kind of, you know, fizzled out.
In fact, Paul was guarding for a lot of those kicks. I feel like he did more leg kicks than Joe.
Eventually, Paul did start throwing a lot of kicks, but it was really just a positional battle. Nobody landed anything really effective. It never went to the ground. Really, the only reason Paul won this fight was because he was the one
Wait, can I say it?
advancing.
Oh,
go ahead.
okay. I was going to say it was because of that one karate chop he threw in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's not a whole lot to it. He just threw a karate chop at Joe Moreira at some point during this fight.
Man, I want to see a Paul Varlins that's, like, really technically sound. With his size, can you imagine what he'd do in, like, the modern UFC?
Oh, and I just checked my notes again. So, Paul started using his head, literally. Thinking went out the window, except for guarding those leg kicks. And he gets a full palm slap to the face from Joe Moreira, and he looked pissed from that.
I wouldn't slap a polar bear. I don't know
Yeah.
if that's a sound strategy.
Otherwise, it was pretty much just them being very cautious
Like,
with
it was
each other.
a borderline stalemate. I know why it went to Paul Varlins. Oh, by the way, another note on the judging and decisions here. So, again, the judges in full view of the audience, not only are they in full view of the audience, they actually turn the camera to the judges, and the judges hold up the dude's name on, like, a frickin', like, whiteboard.
Yep. No scoring, just this person won.
This dude won, yeah. Very primitive judging. But I will say, they got that one right,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
They also, when they showed the judges at the beginning, they got the order wrong.
Yeah, they were showing one dude while they were talking about the different dude. Again, a little sloppy production-wise, but, you know, when the government's cracking down on your operation, I can understand some hiccups.
If you do have Fight Pass, which is what we use to watch this, you will hear Megatron in the crowd.
Yeah, there was some weird... Oh, maybe it was the feds showing up.
This is the police. We have Megatron.
We were talking before we were going to record here, what would they have done if the police showed up? Like, would they have just arrested everybody? What was the punishment?
Yeah. Like, the situation we were thinking of was, there was that, I guess, tussle in the crowd. And if someone did try to get authorities involved, well, they're going to come up to what is a very high production underground event.
Yeah.
You can't just arrest everyone.
It's just such a weird thing. I'm not going to get into my whole soapbox tangent here, but it just blows my mind that people actually wasted energy on trying to fight the UFC existing.
Yeah.
Especially at this point. I can understand John McCain's assertion of human cockfighting if you'd watched UFC 1.
Yeah.
Because that was, like, just fucking chaos. But at this point, it's a little... I don't want to say professional, because that's not accurate, but it's a little more polished, and for you to dedicate so much energy to stop it is disappointing. But anyway, I don't want to get on my soapbox. Anything else in this fight?
Well, I'm just thinking of the next fight.
Before we get into the murderer?
Yeah. Oh, not even the next fight, the fight after that, and then I can... If John McCain only saw that fight, I can see why he's had some problems with it.
Yeah, we'll get
but,
there.
yeah, we'll get there.
So up next, we have Jerry Bohlander, the Ken Shamrock product, versus Scott Ferozzo, who trained out of the same camp as, I believe, Tank Abbott. And Jerry Bohlander, I'd heard of him before, I'd seen him fight before, but I hadn't clicked on his fucking Wikipedia page, because we found some super sketchy shit.
First off, just from our immediate view on things, Scott Ferozzo, he kind of looks like, just like...
I said he looks like he owns a bistro.
I thought he just kind of looked like a guy who, like, does... He's the one flipping the burgers at a barbecue.
He's like the dad who barbecues, yeah.
Yeah.
We were talking a lot of shit, but I will say, he did put up quite a fight.
He backed up his words and his Fear Me cape poncho.
Oh my god, I completely forgot about that. I'm looking at my notes, and I have written down Scott's attire, and I'm like, what was Scott's attire? Oh yeah, wearing a cape that said Fear Me on it in text that we couldn't figure out what it said until he fully extended those arms.
Yeah.
And then on the back of that cape, it looked like it was a dog murdering some dude.
Yeah.
A little weird, I gotta say. So, Jerry Bohlander, otherwise uninteresting character, has killed 2 people.
Yes.
Both of them legally because he was a cop.
Yep.
So
this is after the event, by the way.
Yeah, let's get into this. I'm going to read through both of these. So, on June 30th, he was involved in the fatal shooting of 38-year-old Jose Luis Martinez Chavez. At the time of the shooting, Bohlander was a Napa County Sheriff's deputy working with the Napa County Special Investigation Bureau. And we dug into this a little bit, and apparently him and another cop were investigating, like, a pot operation. This is in 2010, by the way, so this makes me even more mad. And they identified themselves to the fucking drug dude. Yeah. And apparently he ran into the bushes and reached for something shiny and silver in his pocket, and they opened fire and they shot him. And to be honest, they were right. He had a gun. Yeah. They found a gun on his body that he was clearly searching for, but I'm not going to get on the weed soapbox, but we can agree that's pretty fucked up all around. Now, this was the second time Jerry Bohlander had killed somebody. Yeah. Because in 2005, I'm just going to read you the information we found here, because it's very weird and confusing. So, Bohlander shot Samuel Paul Rodriguez, 41, after Rodriguez came at him with a kitchen knife early Sunday morning at the Gateway Mobile Home Park on Washington Street in yada yada yada. So, apparently he was responding to reports of a dude yelling, and that ended with him killing him. Yeah. Which is a little fucked up. And I believe this entry here is from a family member of that man who was shot, because it's a little kinder to him than what appears to be police report of the incident. So, Samuel Paul Rodriguez was shot and killed. It says as he was waiting for an ambulance called by neighbors. So, it sounds like, I mean, speculation. Obviously, I don't fucking know this dude. It sounds like he wasn't exactly completely mentally stable, and something was going on with his dad, and the police were called. It was just one of those situations where, like, shit just got way out of hand and a cop shot somebody, which happens far too often. But, yeah, so I did not expect to find a murder rap in Jerry Bohlander's Wikipedia entry.
Yeah. I think he was the youngest guy fighting tonight, wasn't he?
He was like 21, right? Or 22?
Yeah. 21.
So, quite the checkered past for Jerry Bohlander.
At least from our perspective.
Yeah, I will say, this is obviously my opinion, but these 2 incidents, at the very least, I can say are unfortunate. So this was the fighter, by the way, Scott Ferozzo, that Bruce Buffer was managing. So, fun fact.
This is the first time we have Bruce Buffer in the UFC.
So, as we were saying, Scott was pressing the action early on, and this fight almost went to decision. It went 9 minutes deep, and the only reason Jerry Bohlander came out on top was because he caught a guillotine choke, but it looked kind of shitty. I don't really know how deep he had that in there, but it was deep enough to get Scott to tap, and even though he was losing the majority of the fight, Jerry Bohlander would advance.
You theorized that Scott gave up because there was a weird moment where Jerry was on the fence, and then he let go and flipped around on Scott and ended up kneeing him in the top of the head.
Oh, yeah.
And you thought that maybe he tapped because the pain was setting in.
Yeah, that was also something that was super common, as we were seeing back then. A lot of fighters submitting to strikes. This wasn't submitting to strikes, but just based on how that choke looked and from the fact that it was standing, they weren't even on the ground when Scott tapped, I feel like that knee probably played in to the submission.
We're kind of getting this all over the place, but Scott also had a 130-pound advantage, quote-unquote advantage.
Advantage, yeah.
And started off the fight with 2 suplexes.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, Scott looked really promising. I thought we were actually going to see him advance, and I imagine after that kind of performance, we're probably going to see him again in some more cards.
I hope so. I feel like we really what's the word I'm looking for?
Undersold?
Undersold him, I guess, when we first saw him. And
or underestimated, rather.
Underestimated, that's what I'm looking for. When we first saw him, and
yeah, we were talking a lot of shit, and he proved us wrong.
Yeah. He came out swinging, and he was good.
Up next, we have Paul Herrera versus Gary Goodridge. This fight produced one of the most violent... Oh, I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. Earlier, I stated that Scott Ferozzo had trained out of Tank Abbott's camp. But I see here in my notes, it was actually Paul Herrera who trained at Tank Abbott's camp, which makes the story Matt's going to tell us in a little bit make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So, Gary Goodridge came in looking fucking jacked, and I said to Matt, he may be from north of the border because he's Canadian, but his supplements appear to be south of the border.
Yeah.
So, Gary came in practicing the art of... Can you pronounce it? Because I constantly fuck it up. Kuksuluan, excuse me. And apparently this page does not exist on Wikipedia for the martial art itself, so...
It's too niche. Gary Goodridge, also a... What was it? World Championship arm wrestler?
Yeah, he was a world champion in arm wrestling, which I didn't even know was a thing you could do. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
And also, they kept shouting out random facts as guys were walking to the octagon. Gary Goodridge, a welder at a Honda factory in Alston, Ontario.
So, Gary Goodridge went into this a little unexperienced. I can read this from Wikipedia. I'll just paraphrase it. So, he had about a month of experience in this fighting style, because when he was given the opportunity to do this, he didn't have a fighting style.
Yeah.
He just kind of took it on a whim and had to get the proper credentials for it. He still got a 4th degree black belt and a free dobok.
What the fuck is dobok? Oh, he gave him a fucking gi.
Yeah.
He got a free gi for representing the school's gym. That makes sense because he had the gi on there.
Yeah.
So one of the more interesting things about Gary's backstory in coming into this fight is that when he went to that gym in this Korean martial art, he found out that that school was already training a fighter to compete in the UFC. So, and I quote, Gary was forced to fight him and won in dominant fashion. He was quickly authored a 4th degree black belt and ended up going into UFC 8 with less than a month's experience in the art. So, as Matt was saying earlier, very strange credentials for Gary coming into the fight, but quickly ended it.
Yeah.
His opponent, Paul Herrera, another Wikipedia-less fighter. This fight produced like the most brutal KO I think I've ever seen. Gary would get him in a crucifix, and from that position would just rain down about 9 or 10 of the most violent elbows I've ever seen. And the KO was so violent, they actually didn't show the replay.
Yeah.
We had to rewind the event to watch it again because they didn't want to show the replay.
It was also really fast.
It was extremely fast. The fight was, I believe, 13 seconds.
Chemo was crying in the background. Chemo being a very big fan of Jesus, by the way. So seeing this crucifix, you get the joke.
So Matt has a very interesting note for us about Gary's preparation for this fight.
He had a lot of inspiration with good intentions, even if they weren't true.
Misguided, even.
Yeah. So, this is a quote from Gary. In the lead up to the fight, some of my friends told me that Tank Abbott was a racist skinhead who was involved with the KKK.
By the way, of course, again, Tank Abbott training Paul Herrera.
In this quote, of course it wasn't true, but my friends said it was so I would train harder. Going into the Herrera fight, I wasn't confident at all in my technical fighting abilities. However, I was confident that I wasn't going to lose to this guy. I swore up and down that I was not going to lose to a racist jerk. I didn't care what I needed to do because in my mind I was now fighting for all black people. So a very honorable reason
Yeah,
for
even if
fighting
it was...
this brutally.
Yeah.
Even if the reason wasn't true.
I suppose, you know, whatever works as motivation works, you know?
Yeah.
It's actually not super uncommon. Not to that level, but in a lot of sports, I know athletes create animosity just so they have inspiration to play against each other. Super, super tangential. I was watching a video about Shaquille O'Neal and David Robinson, and Shaq started this huge beef and made up shit about David Robinson, and years later said, yeah, none of that shit was true, but I had to tell myself that so I could, like, get excited for those games. So I feel like that's something that's, like, super common in pro sports to, even if the information's not reliable, if it helps you get up for the competition, roll with it.
Yeah. And again, even Gary acknowledged this. It wasn't true, this KKK skinhead stuff.
Yeah, Paul Herrera and Tank Abbott may be jerks, or Tank Abbott at least is a jerk. I don't know much about Paul Herrera, but not white supremacists.
Yeah.
Pretty sure they're not white supremacists.
As far as my notes go, it's pretty quick, but the biggest part is crucifix knockout. Do that to Chemo.
Chemo, by the way, we didn't mention this earlier, and we definitely should have. The super fight tonight outside of this tournament was Ken Shamrock versus Chemo. We mentioned Ken, but did not mention his opponent. So there you go. Chemo in the building with his Jesus tattoos.
Can you imagine how much of a religious moment Chemo would have getting caught in a crucifix?
You're really making me want to see a Gary Goodridge Chemo fight.
It would be so fun. I feel like Chemo would be a changed person.
Alright, so now we are into the semifinals of the event, and we see the tournament format fail again. Another alternate. It seems like they only actually had one alternate bout, Sam Adkins versus Keith Mikheil, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Sam Adkins won in 50 seconds via submission to strikes, and would replace Paul Varelans. Did they mention why Paul pulled out?
I don't remember them saying any reason why.
I'd assume it was injury-related from his fight with Joe Moreira, but it's a pretty uneventful fight to get injured in.
Isn't this the third time Paul's pulled out due to injury?
I think this is the second time. One time he replaced Pat Smith, who pulled out due to injury.
Oh, okay.
So Don Fry, instead of fighting Paul Varelans, a fight we were very excited to see, is here fighting Sam Adkins. Don Fry, again, in the octagon for less than a minute, making relatively quick work of Sam Adkins. 48 seconds, doctor stoppage to punches. I believe Don punched him in the back of the head a bunch of times, which, again, totally legal back then, but another fight where we would not be able to see that kind of finish in 2019.
Yeah. Also, this is where we first saw our big boy, Dan, the Beast, in the crowd.
Important to note. Dan the Beast Severn, coach of Don Fry. And as you can see here, if you're watching on YouTube in our wonderful photo, the eyes of the Beast creep in the bottom right with the Tom Selleck mustache up front.
I commented while we were watching it that Don Fry is like the mini-boss before you fight Dan Severn.
And of course, I was forced to make a "don't speak to me or my son" joke.
Oh, man. I love these two. I love their mustaches.
We'd actually see Dan later tonight not only coaching Don, but also on commentary for the Chemo and Ken fight.
Mm-hmm. For the semifinals, we also brought back the intro videos. All of them shot on the beach.
Yeah, it seemed like they wanted to, you know, pick up the pace on the production a little bit, so they didn't give anybody intros in the opening round, but all the fighters who made it to the semis, they got their little video of them in the sand with the 90s pop music playing in the background.
And it really sucked for the people that they were, like, demonstrating their moves on, because they would always end up on their backs or on the ground somehow.
Getting sand in their eyes.
Yeah, they're always squinting terribly.
It's a terrible surface to grapple on.
Yeah.
I just thought about that. You're going to get shit in your eyes for sure. And other places.
Yeah.
Up next, we would see Jerry Bohlander face off against Gary Goodridge. And Gary, in his pre-fight intro video, I can quote as saying, "Big Daddy is bringing home the bacon."
Mm-hmm.
I love Gary Goodridge. We're going to see him a lot. And I was actually shocked to find out that he had so few credentials coming into this fight, because he looked real good.
Yeah. Gary also had a 58-pound advantage in Mexican supplements to Jerry Bohlander.
So how long did this fight last? It seemed like it was fairly competitive, but eventually Gary would get the best of Jerry after 5.5 minutes. There was one moment where Jerry was holding onto the fence for dear life, and Gary was like, I don't want you there anymore, and just fucking ripped him off the fence.
A part I really liked was Gary was on his back with Jerry on top. Even in my notes, I had some trouble just typing out quickly enough Gary and Jerry. I feel like I'm going to trip it up with my words. Gary was on his back and just decided at one point he wanted to be on top, and so he lifted Jerry off of him and put him onto his back.
He just power bottomed the shit out of him and fucking flipped him over.
Raw strength.
He had no technique there. That was just, get out of my way, I am twice your size.
Yeah. With Gary on top, Jerry was upside down at one point. I thought he was going to just pick Jerry up and drop him on his head. He didn't do that. Instead, he just mashed his foot into Jerry's face and started punching his face as well. John figured this is probably where it ends and called it.
So Gary Goodridge advancing to the UFC tournament finals against Don Fry.
I like the call here because I don't think Jerry had any real good chances of getting out of it.
Yeah, I'd rather, back then and now, I'd much rather see a fight get stopped too early than too late. Because we saw a couple fights before this, not in this event, but in the other events, where definitely should have stepped in a lot sooner. Now we are to the super fight. Chemo versus Ken Shamrock. So, interesting fight. Remember, Chemo had fought Royce Gracie and didn't defeat him, but that was the first time Royce would have to pull out after the fight and couldn't advance due to basically exhaustion because that fight went on for so long. So, Chemo's back to fight Ken, and it was a pretty good matchup, and it was cool to have Dan on commentary to offer his insight.
Yeah, because he had already fought Ken, so he knows how Ken operates in the ring, or octagon. Sorry. Chemo came out. I don't think he could ship his cross with him, and he couldn't get one commissioned in time.
Yeah, he couldn't get that cross through customs.
So instead, they had just a very vague poster with Jesus on the crucifix.
Yeah, what did it say? It was some weird shit. Do you have the quote in there from what the fucking banner said?
No, but it was something like, if I bleed and you bleed, then what does this mean? Something like that.
Oh, I remember what it was. It was, if I'm okay and you're okay, then explain this. And it was just like a picture of Jesus being crucified.
Yeah.
Or an artist's rendition. There are no photos from Jesus being crucified. But you know what I mean.
And I don't know what we could really do about something that happened 2,000 years ago. But
He seems to like hold on to grudges a little bit here.
yeah.
So the fight itself was fairly competitive, as I said. Ken established side control. It was mostly a grappling exchange, not too many strikes going back and forth. Ken brought him to the ground, and Ken just, even though Chemo was a little bit larger, Ken, clearly the much more experienced and technical fighter, eventually brought Chemo to the ground, and for a while there was fishing for a leg lock. Prior to that leg lock, he had an opportunity to sink in a rear naked choke, but was way too slow on it. And Chemo actually escaped, and we thought that Chemo would perhaps obtain the upper hand. But again, shortly after, got that ankle snatched up. And
Cranked it.
yeah, I thought it was a heel hook, but Ken said it was a knee bar. Regardless, a pretty dominant victory in 4 minutes and 24 seconds. Ken Shamrock retaining his Super Fight Championship. This is super weird. So, obviously we don't have lineal champions for the weight divisions yet, but we do have this weird fucking Super Fight Championship floating around that's had to be moved around due to dubious circumstances. Again, remember, the draw with Ken and Royce was the first fight for the Super Fight title, and it was a draw, so they just gave it to Dan, who won the tournament.
Yeah.
So Ken Shamrock, you know what was interesting that he said? He said that he hadn't lost since Royce Gracie, which is true. However, I would not exactly brag about the two 30-minute draws on my resume in the preceding fights.
He hasn't lost, what was it, 3 super fights?
Yeah.
He's never lost in all 3 super fights. 2 of them were draws.
Yeah, I mean, when he said he was undefeated in super fights, I mean, it's technically true, but, you know.
I like Chemo's one technique, which was his smushing Ken's face technique. He was like, if any of you have seen Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah!
It was like the mountain squishing the Viper's face.
It was a little fucked. Obviously you can't do to a human being what happened in the Game of Thrones, but from that clip, I'm so scarred that whenever I see anybody grab somebody's head like it's a fucking watermelon, I start to freak out.
Yeah. I think that was just Chemo being like, I'm gonna dominate you, but then you're not gonna get a whole lot out of that other than just hurting their face a little bit.
Man, I don't really know what Chemo was doing at this point. In the pre-fight intro, they said he favored intensity over technique. How'd that work out last time, Chemo? Not exactly effective. Again, coming in here, I think Chemo was the stronger fighter, but that does not necessarily mean he was the better fighter. Joseon, conspicuous by his absence at this event, perhaps Chemo had learned about his friend's crimes and separated, or maybe he was just chilling somewhere committing some felonies. Who knows?
Oh, well, we don't need him.
That's for sure.
It was at this point, after the fight,
a brawl in the crowd erupted. They didn't have a very good shot of it. It seems like they cut over to it late, and some chairs were thrown. I mean, I was telling Matt, Puerto Rico has a history of literally stabbing pro wrestlers, so throwing some chairs around at an MMA event does not surprise me.
They had this small fight. Security came in. Of course, they don't have police there because this is technically an underground event.
Yeah.
There was another moment where they had the camera pan over to a crowd that was looking at something off-screen.
But they never showed us what it was.
Yeah, they never showed us.
Perhaps there was another fight in the crowd. You know, when it's 100 degrees, I imagine you get a little ornery. So, in the finals of the David versus Goliath tournament, we technically did have somebody who was billed as a David versus somebody who was billed as a Goliath in Don versus Gary. So, Gary, for this fight, decided that, fuck this gi, it's 100 degrees, and removed it before the fight. Now, there's really no way to parse how this would have gone had he worn the gi, maybe to have a better grappling advantage, he could have closed the distance better, but Don Fry was just clearly the more polished striker. The first fighter I remember seeing in the UFC to this point throwing jabs and uppercuts and just like really crisp boxing technique that we hadn't seen effective in the UFC yet. All the boxers we'd seen to this point had zero grappling experience, so they couldn't keep it on the feet. But Don, having some amateur wrestling credentials and training with fucking Dan Severn, obviously has at least enough grappling experience to keep it on the feet where he has better advantage. And kind of just teed off on Gary a little bit there. Gary also, knowing now that he didn't have a ton of experience coming into this fight, these errors make more sense. But there was a couple exchanges where Gary threw Don and did not follow up on top of him. He just chucked him like it was a pro wrestling match instead of following up, and sort of admired his handiwork, which really prevented him from, if he wanted to grapple, he certainly had the opportunity.
Yeah. He just didn't follow up with it. My notes are pretty straightforward on this one. Don with the jabs, as you mentioned. Elbows on Gary. There were a lot of elbows. Not all of them were super hard.
Not as hard as the ones on Paul Herrera, that's for sure.
No. I get flashbacks to that now. Gary tosses Don, sorta. Gary gets on the fence. Don gets good hits on Gary's head. Don is on the fence. Gary pulling Don off the fence, but Don was holding onto the fence from the top like a pull-up bar. So Don's almost horizontal at this point.
Like doing bicep curls with the edge of the cage. It was real weird.
And we had to go back and rewatch this just so that we could get this right in our notes. Don lets go, grabs Gary. Gary gets Don's back, but is too high, gets flipped by Don, and hammered on, like, just with hammers.
Hammer fists.
Hammer fists, yeah.
So the way this fight would actually end is Don would actually get mount on Gary after that exchange Matt just mentioned, and if you're on Wikipedia, submission to position. Gary would later explain in his post-fight interview that the reason he tapped out was because he realized basically that he was fucked and no need to take any more damage, which I can respect. I mean, live to fight another day. I don't think... Dude, that guy probably had never had somebody mounted on top of him about to punch him in the face before in his life.
Probably not.
Which is crazy, because, like, dude's fucking jacked. Like, if you were like, oh yeah, this dude fights, and you just showed me Gary Goodridge, I'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. That dude looks like he fucks people up. But apparently a gentle giant prior to UFC 8.
Yeah. He had no reasons for fighting. until now.
Not a lot of combat in the welding factory.
It was also kind of weird to see his corner threw in the towel seconds after he tapped.
I couldn't tell if he tapped physically or verbally, but regardless, yeah, they threw in the towel afterward. The commentary mentioned, the first time we've seen a towel thrown in the night, but it was after the stoppage anyway, so it wasn't super consequential. But honestly, props to Gary's corner for, like him, knowing when he was fucked and not letting him take unnecessary damage.
Yeah. After this, we had both fighters interviewed, and
pretty lengthy interviews.
Yeah.
Pretty good. They had good responses, but again, I wanna give Jeff some credit because Jeff Blatnick is important to the sport of MMA and important to especially these early UFC cards. But dude, just talk to somebody who's conducted interviews. It was a little painful to watch. He didn't pull the mic away like he'd been doing prior to this, but the questions were just so clumsy.
Also, this was happening throughout the night. There's these little graphics popping up in the corner that I feel like weren't supposed to be there.
I could just imagine, I could just imagine dudes in the truck worried the feds are gonna show up, hitting the wrong button, freaking the fuck out. I'd love to talk to somebody who actually worked this event and find out what the work environment of the illegal UFC 8 in Puerto Rico was, because that sounds like some crazy shit to me. We found a lot of crazy shit already, but I can only imagine the stories from somebody who was actually inside the event.
I wonder if they got their prize money. They never mentioned anything about prize money.
They did mention prize money. Obviously, I'm assuming they made money. Of course, why else would you do this? But
they had a buy rate of 300,000
and an attendance of 13,000. But yeah, they didn't mention the prize pool, which they did in every other card. So it's very strange. Perhaps, once the feds start cracking down, or I'm making jokes here. It's not the federal government. It's the government of Puerto Rico that made it illegal. So it's not like the United States federal government. But yeah. Up next, we have UFC 9, entitled here on Wikipedia, UFC 9 Motor City Madness, where we have Ken Shamrock in a rematch with the Ultimate champion, Dan Severn.
I love Dan Severn.
He's just such a lovable character.
He's like that strong dad kind of look. I don't know how else to put it.
The only other way I could describe him is that he looks like the vaudeville dudes who lift weights. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Like the muscle men with the mustaches.
Yeah, like 1920s muscle men.
Yeah. Up next, we'll see Ken face off against Dan in the rematch. A little bit of spoilers here, but I was looking through the comments from UFC 6, where Ken and Dan originally faced off, and one of our viewers noted that the rematch was a little less spectacular, to put it kindly. But, getting ahead of ourselves, we'll get there next time. Until then, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a like on YouTube or on SoundCloud wherever you're viewing this. And we'll see ya next time.